We're going to look at chapter 5, what we're going to be looking at here in a minute. What I want to talk about is, what does a life well lived look like? I mean, we can give all kinds of definitions of that, a lot of good ones, some not so good, and some excellent. I mean, we can, our 401ks, visiting grandkids, traveling, those are all good things, and not a thing wrong with any of that. But I think as Christians, we should be forced to consider, how does God define a life well lived? You know, what would He say today? And we should then incorporate that into our lives in these latter years. We are pretty much all in, except for one. There's only one or two here younger, but we're all there in that together. Now, having said that, we're looking at Daniel 5. Now, Daniel, if you remember, the first 6 chapters are where we're talking about his life. The last 6 chapters talk about the prophecies and other things that he talks about. So we're in the first 6 chapters, and we're going to be talking in the latter end of his life. Okay, this is at the point that Daniel is about 83 or so years old, give or take. Daniel is pretty neat in that he is one of the few characters in the Bible, or maybe anywhere, I guess you could say, that seem to live a very consistent, Christ-centered life. There's no upsets or anything bad said about him at any point in his life. And he served in a difficult time. He was outstanding as a politician and then later as a prophet as well. And it was under different administrations in a foreign power that he was serving. In looking at all this, at the history, Daniel first came to Babylon in about 605 BC when Jerusalem had been overrun and all the young people had taken with them that were deemed to be appropriate, and they were going to be trained by the king's court. When he first came to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar was the king. Later on, the next era that he served under was the Belshazzar era, and then after that came the Medo-Persian era over his lifetime. Now we're looking at the very latter end of King Belshazzar's time at the end of chapter 5. Now, Belshazzar was the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. And we find in chapter 5 that Belshazzar is having a feast. He's having a big party, and he's invited about 1,000 of the nobles from the empire. And remember now, Babylon is the empire of the world at this time. They rule it all. There is nobody bigger than them. You might liken it to the United States, but they would be considered even bigger than the U.S. And at this party, it's probably been going on for a week to 2 weeks or so. Toward the end of it here, the wine is coming out and it's flowing freely and everybody's drunk. And so the king decides, well, let's do something a little bit different. So he calls on the servants to go to the royal treasury and bring out the golden cups and vessels and so on that had been confiscated or captured when they overran Jerusalem, that were used in the temple worship services. The reigning notion, by the way, at this time in history was that if I declared war on you, if I won, then my God must be better than your God. That was the way the logic went. So he considered, in his way of looking at things, his God more supreme than the Jewish God, or the God, Yahweh. But anyway, they bring out the golden vessels, they fill them full of wine, they're all drinking, and they end up worshiping the vessels themselves. So they end up worshiping the created things rather than the Creator. Which, by the way, that happens then and happens today as well. If man does not know who the God is, he'll come up with some other God to worship. We're always looking for our God to fall down before and worship. So we're all mankind is that way, whether you go to the jungles or to Wall Street in New York, it's always that way. But God's judgment is rendered at that time. as they are all drunk and drinking the vessels. And what happens is, all of a sudden, a hand appears out of nowhere, and a finger starts writing on the wall, in the plaster of the wall. And you can imagine what's going on. Everybody's scared to death. Well, this is obviously never happened before. And they don't know what to do. They call upon their wise men, come, interpret, what does this mean? And they can read the words, which I'll get to in just a moment, but they don't know what it means. So there's a lady there present called the Queen Mother, and that doesn't mean that she was necessarily the queen or wife of the king. She would have been more of an older woman who was held more of an honorary position, but she's a little older, and she remembers Daniel from times past, that he had always been a noted interpreter of dreams and visions and that sort of thing. And she says, well, why don't you call him? Maybe he can help you here. So that's exactly what they do. They call him, and Daniel, before he gets there, he knows about the foolishness of their party and what's been going on. So he comes, and like a good preacher, this is great. Like a good preacher, Daniel shows up and he says, yes, I'll tell you what it means. But before he tells them what it means, he preaches a little sermon to the king about it. So you can't pass up a good opportunity. But what he does, he talks about what's on the wall, which was Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And what that means is, Mene is a measurement of weight, and it's repeated twice here. And then Tekel is a weight of money. And Parsin is means to be broken or divided. Now, like I said, the wise men could read the words. I'm sure that's why they were wise men, I guess. But they didn't understand how those things fit. What does it mean? It doesn't make any sense. And honestly, it didn't make any sense to me either. But to Daniel, it did, because Daniel had the insight of God whispered in his ear. And what it means is, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been waiting about and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So that very night, King Belshazzar is killed. And the Medes and Darius of the Medes and Persians takes over the kingdom. I mean, that's a pretty prominent, big thing that happens there all of a sudden. Let's see. There we go. So let's look now at a couple verses there in Daniel. In chapter 5, verses 16 and 17. And he says, but I, talking about King Belshazzar, have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known the interpretation. Okay, so Daniel is being offered riches beyond measure here, and the promise of the fame and the power to be the number 3 ruler in this whole vast empire if he can interpret it. The point I'm getting at this stage as I'm talking here is that in general, people that are a little bit older in age, as we find Daniel here right now, they tend to be unaffected by the attractions that would have tripped them up earlier in life. Money, sex, power, whatever you want to say, those things tend to be in the past. Been there, done that, didn't do anything for me. Now I'm a little bit older and I'm a little bit wiser, generally speaking. And that's where we find Daniel. And that's our first point here. And as I was thinking about this, let me tell you a little quick story. When I was dating Wanda, and I was getting to know her, I came into the family, and her father, who is a farmer, he's passed away now, but he was a farmer here in the Scottsdale area. And he was not a big farmer, doing thousands of acres and multiple tractors and all the stuff that big farmers do. He was a small-time farmer, but he made enough money to clothe the kids and educate them and do all the things you need to do. But I can remember in those early years when I first got to know the family, he was like, I guess, a lot of farmers and maybe a lot of people, but but he was beset by all kinds of anxious fears. What's going to be the price of hogs? Is it going to rain tomorrow? Is my hay going to get wet? Am I going to be able to get this crop in? Am I going to make enough money on my crop this year to put my food on the table? And the list goes on and on. Those are all, of course, valid concerns. But he was pretty anxious about all that stuff. But as I watched him, a little bit later, as I got to know him, he, first off, was diagnosed with prostate cancer, which in the course of 15 years, eventually he died from it. But nevertheless, in those years, I saw him mellow out. And he quit being so anxious about everything. He read his Bible more, he came to church. He always was a good church-going man, but he seemed to pay more attention. He prayed more, he played with the grandkids more. He had established some things that were a little bit more important than the price of hogs. And that's where he was at. And that's what we see here with Daniel. Daniel's, like I said, he's in his 80s. He's lived a full life under various administrations. He's had power. He's probably had more money than he can spend, just he by himself. But what he's learned here, he's achieved a level of freedom that, to some extent, is reserved for the elderly. Though he aged in learning this, by the way. He's seen and understood that attaining those things doesn't matter all that much in the eternity, in the scheme of eternity as it relates to God. But if we stop there, we probably would miss the point. And that is, there's a more important point that's more foundational than just necessarily achieving freedom and joy. And that is that the real reason for the freedom lies in the knowledge that God is sovereign. I'm having trouble working this clicker here. I'm not used to doing this clicker thing. There it is. Okay. So what does it mean to think of God as being sovereign? Well, in a nutshell, it means God is in charge of everything. Me, you, the past, the future, the present, the stock market, the virus. I mean, he's got it all in hand. He knows what's happening at all stages. Now, all of you would nod your head. You would have no problem with agreeing with what I'm saying. You would agree with it. We all know the right answer to that question. But the rub comes, does my life really reflect that? Does my day-to-day on Monday or Tuesday or Saturday, does it reflect that God's in control? Or am I constantly kind of exercising my own control over my own future? But Daniel, having this freedom and understanding who was really in charge, gave him the freedom to stand up, literally, before the strongest man in their universe and tell him, you're going to die, buddy. You're not going to last. The God that makes golden vessels is coming for you. And your time is at an end. It's your kingdom and all this power and all this fame and all this money, all this stuff you gathered up, it's going to be taken from you and given to somebody else. Knowing that God is sovereign is transformative in the life of a believer. It's free and even joyful in our day-to-day things. But look at our world today. Where are we? Our world is beset by fear. I'd say a mind-numbing fear as well. Everyone seems to be fearful. In the church and outside of the church, we fear the stock market crashing. We fear the Republicans winning. We fear the Democrats winning. We fear the virus. We fear being around people without a mask on. We fear the failure of science and medicine to give us answers to all these things. We fear global warming. We fear the next germ that's going to come upon the horizon. We fear falling down and can't get up. We fear dementia. We fear going into a nursing home, and all these things in our latter years. We even fear being able to articulate the gospel message to somebody else, to be able to talk to them. So we're all beset by fears, some bigger than others. You get the point. We're all fearful. But look at Daniel. Daniel was not fearful. As he stood there, he was committed to telling the truth, whatever happened. And literally, his life was on the line. Yes, I know the king promised to make him rich and put a gold chain on his neck, which he actually did do at the end of the story. But at that point, when you're standing there, gold chains don't mean a whole lot. When you got to speak the word to somebody like that. The reason that I keep coming back to it is because Daniel had a correct theology of what sovereignty was. And it enabled him to transcend all those other things and to literally stand there. So, having said that, how do we appropriate and learn and gain that same kind of basic sovereignty or confidence in life that Daniel had? That's kind of the bottom line, isn't it? The fear we're talking about is the kind of fear that numbs us into inactivity and kills the spirit. When I was doing this little message thing here, I did a little research, and I discovered something that to me was interesting anyway. There is a little animal in the ocean called, it's very beautiful, in fact, if you look at the pictures, it's called a blue-ringed octopus. The little fellow is only about 8 inches in diameter, just a little thing. He swims around in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but he's considered to be one of the Earth's most venomous marine animals. He harbors enough toxic chemicals to kill 26 adults, and there's no antivenom available for it. The bite is so small and unnoticeable with such a little small animal that you get bitten and you don't even know you've been bitten until the symptoms begin to occur. And what happens is you get a gradual besetting of paralysis of your muscles and all your body parts and everything. And eventually, of course, your heart and your breathing, your lungs, all of it begins to quit over a little period of time there. And but the interesting thing about it is when that begins happening, you're fully awake. You understand what's happening. You just can't do anything about it. You're just there until you finally die. That's kind of what I'm trying to allude to is the fear that I'm talking about when we let the fear of fill in the blank overwhelm us. It numbs us, and we become ineffective at much of anything around us. Now, what are we going to do about it? What are some antidotes that we can take to offset, at least from a spiritual standpoint, that kind of fear? I'm going to give you 3 suggestions here. There's nothing special about these ideas. They work for this, and they work for a whole host of other things too. The first one is a deep, aggressive, contemplative, meditative, daily devotional practice. There simply is no substitute for being in the Word on a daily basis. If you're depending on what this old boy can tell you, or what Shandy can tell you, I think you would agree, on a given Sunday, and you don't do anything for the 6 days, you're backing up. You're not progressing in the faith. You're not maturing. And that said, it's unreasonable to expect maturity or growth if you're not doing that. Fear instead will become my constant companion. And my decision-making ability, well, it won't look any different than my neighbor down the street that I suspect doesn't know the Lord. You won't be able to really tell much difference between us. On the other hand, if I am engaged in that kind of daily devotions, I will experience a gradual growing and maturing and just a general growth in everything. You know, we're talking about the fruits of the Spirit in some of our other sermons. Well, all those things develop along with the sovereignty that I'm talking about here as well. But all those things are going to be good. It's what's said in Romans 12:2. If you want to take a look at that later, but it's where Paul's talking about we're being transformed and our mind is being renewed in the Spirit of Christ. Now, the second thing there is having the daily devotion. Yes, it's important. But what are you going to do about it? You have to have actionable steps of how you're going to incorporate whatever it was you learned and you thought about. You've got to figure out how you're going to translate that into something in the real world, in real time. And then thirdly, It comes in living with the knowledge that God really is in control over all things. And I'm not, by the way. And God being perfect and God being good, He can handle it. He's got it all in hand. That's where Daniel was. And that's where Daniel had lived most of his life. But you got to remember, we're seeing it at 80 years old here right now, okay? And you don't just pull up that kind of courage to stand before the king on the spur of the moment when the king's looking you in the eye and you got to give your answer. No, it comes over a lifetime. It comes over a daily devotion. And we know from Daniel and some other stories that Daniel went and he prayed every day. No matter what his administrative duties were, he went and prayed 3 times a day, in spite of being in a foreign land and foreign dictators and all that sort of thing. Now, if you're like me, you can't claim to have lived such a stellar Christian life that you're maybe a Daniel necessarily. I don't make that claim of myself by any stretch. But the good news is that at any age, God can use us. God is gracious and kind and long-suffering. And whether I'm 80 or 100 or 16, whatever I am, He can take what's there and He can grow it and mature it and use it. We are not called to be like the world. We're called to be different in all the ways, shapes, and forms. And when people look at you and I, they look at how we respond to a crisis. That's especially something I used just this past Sunday in Sunday school was, think about a tube of toothpaste. You look at a tube of toothpaste and you can see it, of course, Crest and Colgate and all that sort of thing. But you don't know what's inside. The only way you can know what's inside of it is squeeze on the tube. And something squirts out the end. You can see it's green, it's blue, or whatever it is. That's the way life is. When you get squeezed, people find out what's in here. And what's in here, what comes out, is what they're going to know that you and I are made of. Having said that now, what's the most important work I suggest that we can do? Especially in our latter years. This would apply at any time. Look at the verses on the screen there. This is a verse from chapter 5, verse 30, and then some verses from chapter 9, 1 through 3. It says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. In the first year of Darius, the son of Arashis, by descent of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking Him by prayer and pleas for mercy, with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. As we get into our advanced years, as Daniel did, what does the world tell us? Take it easy. You paid your dues, enjoy retirement, travel, do all those nice things. And those are good things. There's nothing wrong with any of those things, of course. But that's not really what we see happen here with Daniel. We see Daniel diving into the Word of God, reading in particular the book of Jeremiah, and a question emerges about this 70-year exile that's been taking place around Jerusalem. Now, I'm not going to get into the prophecy aspects of what's going on. That would be another day for another time. But right now, I'm looking at Daniel and his life well lived. What he did, and what we all should be doing, is he let the Scriptures impact him. He let them weigh upon his heart. And he fasted and he prayed. He wanted to know. He wanted some answers. And the only person that could give him answers was God. And so that's who he goes to God. Now, at this point in time, you remember, his previous king has just been killed in one night. And he's under a new reign right now. The whole kingdom is in an uproar. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. if anything's going to happen. I mean, we've all been killed, all the nobles killed, I mean, all positions taken away, all these things that's going to happen, could be happening. And so that's where Daniel's at this point. So that his future is uncertain. So this most important work that I'm calling it is to pray. And it's kind of interesting too, like I mentioned in my earlier story about my father-in-law, it's true in his life, and I've seen it in many, many other people's lives as we get a little bit older. We tend to come to the knowledge and insight that, when I was younger, I was raising a family, I had to go get work, I had to do the things that your boss wanted, I had to do all the mow the grass, whatever I had to do. I had to do this longer than I could get done. And those are all needful things, obviously. But Daniel, again, is at this point when maybe those things weren't quite as important. He's come to the point where prayer matters. Think about just more quickly, in our last book of the Bible, Revelation, you know that John there was in his elderly years when he was given this big vision and dream, or whatever it was, that he received. There is a certain connection going on there, I believe, as we get a little bit older. So we've seen God's sovereignty at work in this lesson here. And it's a life that he's lived that's worth imitating. It's not the length of life that makes a life well lived. It's the quality. I'm sure you all agree. Let me tell you a short story, and then I'll be closing here in just a moment. In February of 1943, we had World War II going on. And there was a German university student named Sophie Scholl who was convicted of high treason against the Nazi regime and executed by guillotine. Now, Sophie and her brother had grown up as a good Lutheran children in their church. That Lutheranism was the dominant religion in Germany. It was, and I guess it still is today, I suppose. But they had grown up as what you would call nominal Christians. They had a working knowledge. They could tell you the Bible stories. They could talk about who Jesus is and things like that. They'd attended all their life, probably, and their parents probably gave tithes and offerings, that sort of thing. But they were not saved. They were just good people. That's what I mean by nominal Christians here. As they were getting later in the year, in their advanced teenage years, 17, 18 years old, it became time to go off to college. And Hans, the older brother, went off to college first. And then she came along just shortly thereafter as well. And in college, they were exposed to some Christians, and they became saved. And also, though, combined with their salvation was the bringing together of all the things they've seen happen in Germany. Because at this time, the Polish people were being rounded up and killed, the Jews were being rounded up and killed, and Germany as a country was not the Germany they had known in their childhood. It was a very evil, wicked, difficult place. So they didn't know what to do. So they did the only thing they needed to do. They decided, they and some friends, they would start writing a little newsletter, and they would mail it to people around the city and maybe outside of the city, trying to awaken the population to the evil and wickedness of the Nazi regime. And that's what they were doing until they were captured. And of course, as I said, when they were captured, they were killed by guillotine, by beheading. Let me read you something. When Sophie was being led out to die, she said this: "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter? If through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action." And her brother Hans had written to a friend before this, he had written, "Should one go off and build a little house with flowers outside the windows and a garden outside the door, and extol and thank God and turn one's back on the world and its filth? Isn't seclusion a form of treachery, of desertion? I'm weak and puny, but I want to do what's right. I think we can agree they lived and died a life of quality. It was relatively short in those months or maybe a year or so that they were in college before they were rounded up and killed. They refused to flee culture, nor did Daniel. Daniel didn't flee. He continued working and serving the people he was working for. But safety is never the goal of the Christian life. Faithfulness is. Knowing who our God is. And knowing, in the case of sovereignty, that He has it all in hand. That my anxiousness is just anxiousness. It doesn't matter. It will not change anything. Instead, we're called to live in confidence that He's got today as He had yesterday, and He's going to have tomorrow also. So, we need courage. We need commitment. We need to face each day. And by understanding that, we can live a victorious life. We can live a life well lived, like Daniel. Let's have a word of prayer.